What does the endgame of Final Fantasy XIV look like, and is it any good? In this video I will show you the first Savage fight of Eden's verse, highlighting interesting parts and discussing its role as a gatekeeper into Savage raiding. At the end of the video we score this fight in terms of its difficulty and its mechanics. Make sure to subscribe to the channel if you are curious for more FF14 content in the future. Without further ado, let's check it out. I will start off dropping my main case here right away. E5S makes an interesting step up from fights such as Ruby Weapon Extreme and Memoria Misera Extreme. However, this step up is not because the mechanics are more involved or more frequent, but mostly because the DPS check is a lot less lenient. Note that I'm not stating the DPS check is tight by any means, but whereas the mentioned extreme fights were more in the sense of if you survive the mechanics, you'll be fine, even with a few deaths and a few bad DPS in there. E5S is more of you need to mostly survive the mechanics and you can't be bad at DPS. In case you guys haven't seen it before, the review for Ruby Weapon X is linked in the top right, so make sure to check that out. Also, unfortunately, I have not had the chance to complete Seed of Sacrifice Extreme yet for comparison, so let us just imagine we are living in the world of patch 5.25 for now, even though I heard the same general consensus regarding that fight in particular. Given that, we will go over some of the more interesting mechanics first. The main thread through this fight is managing stacks of surge protection orbs. These are used to shield yourself from certain abilities. The boss will sporadically buff himself, indicated by these 3 lightning orbs floating around him. This almost always signifies a mechanic which requires you to have an orb stack. As an easy first example, the fight starts off with some unavoidable raid-wide damage. Shortly after, it will buff itself and do the same buffed variant of that raid-wide damage. Don't have an orb stack, you're dead. My favorite mechanic reel, Storm Cloud Summons. In short, the 4 furthest players are marked with storm clouds, the 4 nearest with detonation markers. After a while, the storm clouds will spawn on those marked players and hit the ground with AoE damage every few seconds, while the detonation marked players get a different debuff, which is removed by the storm cloud AoE damage. Since the clouds go absolutely ham if they are spawned too close to each other and actually merge, each player is paired up to make sure we get rid of the debuffs. This leads to this curious dance, including players who just dropped off that storm cloud to move around the player with the debuff who is incoming and trying to lose it. To top it all off, we finish this mechanic reel with a massive knockback. The execution of this feels really good once you get it down, and the frequency of it happening twice throughout the fight, both near the beginning of it and near the end of it, has a really nice touch as well. So next is the infamous Furies 14, where 14 rods are spawned and players need to align themselves in such a way that each player except for the main tank is knocked back into one of the rods, on the safe side while they have an orb stack. The main tank gets his own circles to stand in with corresponding duty action and needs to pop a lot of mitigation because Ramuh hits like an absolute truck here. Even though this mechanic is somewhat unforgiving for mistakes, it also feels really good once you get it off properly. We use the strat where we align players with the rods relative to the boss, so you had to think for a second where you would stand. In the second iteration of this mechanic, you even have to find a new safe spot after the knockback by looking at the Thunder Horses, which makes this elaborate dance even more interesting. So next up is Thunderstorm, a personal peeve of mine since I recently switched from Black Mage to Dragoon as a main. This one can be really messy in a group with a lot of melee, especially since we were having issues getting past the enrage and uptime was getting more important. Not only do you need an orb to survive the lightning circle, but if you get hit by an orange AoE, it removes your orb and you need a new one. So even though this mechanic doesn't feel as fulfilling as the previously mentioned ones, I like the more jerky hopping around orange AoE markers, especially now I play Dragoon more. Even though I wish we had a little less melee in our group at this point. Finally, we have the also infamous Chain Lightning. I'll be honest, once you get this down as a group, it is a lot less interesting than it seems. We use the so-called circle strat, so everyone goes into clock positions, and since the chained lightning jumps to the closest person, you only have to move minimally to make the chain lightning jump. It is still very sensitive to mistakes though. So shortly, something about other mechanics that were, in my opinion, less impressive. The stepped leader mechanic is different depending on if the boss buffs himself. In general, the boss buffing himself is set in stone. However, we actually didn't know the last step leader right before the enrage could be either unbuffed or buffed, since we only ever had it unbuffed up to that point. However, I do think this one could be slightly more involved, especially the buffed version feels a bit off. The mechanic I liked least was the so-called tribunal summons, which has the same aspect as step leader, but the only difference is behind which line you have to stand to be safe. This mechanic just felt uninspiring to me compared to the rest of the fight. There is also an ad which spawns now and then and tethers to the player with the most orb stacks, which is meant to target the off tank. This is more of an additional orb management tool than anything else, making sure the off tank has the most stacks, but not more than 3 since that gives you a significant debuff. The ad kinda ignores everyone else besides the off tank unless you get more stacks. This mechanic could have been a bit more interesting in my honest opinion. As a last point, the time between the last chain lightning / step leader and the actual enrage cast is a very long series of raid wide AoEs, either buffed or unbuffed with a lot of waiting in between. I have somewhat mixed feelings about this since it was nice to catch your breath, but it was definitely too drawn out and I'd rather have some more mechanics and a slightly less intense DPS check near the end. I'm curious to see how this is for some of the other Edens vs Savage fights. So after all of those, let's come back to my original case. When comparing the complexity, variety and frequency of mechanics within E5S, I really don't think it is that much of a step up from Ruby Weapon X or Memoria Misera X, but for the first time I actually hit the enrage a few times, which led me to actively thinking how do I optimize my DPS uptime and cooldowns. Looking back at it, this feels like a logical next step in the FF14 raiding scene, but I do hope the coming Savage fights won't only be tighter and tighter DPS checks, but also the next step in complexity and variety of mechanics. That being said, let's jump into our scoring. So even though the normal mode reviews are relatively more centered on audio and visuals, both of them were not really tiring after doing this fight for hours on end. Therefore, I'll stick to my original scoring of S for audio and A for visuals. I'll combine them into the category audio visual with the score A+. So in terms of the other categories, for the Savage fights I want to do a more in-depth scoring. I will divide the old mechanics and difficulty categories into the following. Complexity. So this is the quote-unquote depth of the fight. How much time would it cost you to get used to these mechanics and how much explanation or text would they require? Next is variety. The quote-unquote breadth of the fight. How unique is it and does it consist of many moving parts? Next is frequency, the quote-unquote flow of the fight. Are the mechanics timed well? Is the fight good overall? Or are they just small tidbits here and there that are actually good? Is it tight enough on DPS or does it feel too overdone or does it feel too easy? So last is enjoyment, the quote-unquote feel of the fight. Does it feel like you are making an elaborate dance? Does it bore easily because of some poorly thought out parts, or does it keep you on your toes along the entire way? So let's dive into it. Firstly, complexity. There are some really good mechanic reels in this fight with a few bonus mechanics sprinkled in here and there. I've heard that some people find it a bit too difficult for the first fight of a tier, but I think it's a really nice fit. All in all, it's not perfect with some dull moments in between, but I think it deserves an A nevertheless. So secondly, let's talk about variety. Not only are there some unique mechanics in here I haven't seen before, it is still an excellent hint towards the old Ramuh fight. Mostly though, the repetition, with small variation, feels amazing. So as an example, doing Furies 14 twice, but the second time you also have to move to a random save spot in a small time window, Beautiful. Really deserving of an S, since I don't see fight doing much better in terms of variety. So next is frequency. As we stated, the end of the fight is a bit of a lull, but the rest is really well timed and feels like a good speed for a first fight in Eden's verse relative to the extreme trials in Shadowbringers. Because of this, we give it an A. And lastly, the enjoyment. This one is more subjective, but I have thoroughly enjoyed this fight. And even though it's not perfect, I can't restrain myself from giving this an S for enjoyment. From what I can tell from other people, a lot feel the same. This is a really good first fight for a tier. So putting this all together gives us a score of A+ for Eden's verse Fulmination Savage, just a tad higher than its normal counterpart. Can't wait to look at the rest of the tier before Eden's Promise comes out, which we will jump on right away. And so with that, I want to thank you all very much for watching. As always, let me know in the comments below what your favorite part of E5S is. Subscribe to the channel for more content, and please hit that like button down below. I'll see you all in the next video. Take care.